Right, before we pull the crank out, I'm going to check the crank end float. Now, the crank has a thrust washer here on the rear of the rear main bearing housing, and it has one at the front here, and they wear. Now, what the figure is, I'm not sure. Usually they're like 8 to 10 or 6 to 10 or something like that. So I've put the digital multimeter, digital dial gauge there, and when we lever it forward, I actually have trouble zeroing it because it's a bit of a long arm getting there. So we'll call that 0. So you can see that it's 0. Then we'll lever the crank straight back. So it looks like we have 12.5 thousandths. We'll just call that 12 because I think we had a half a thou, sneaky thou there to start with. Yeah, there's a -1/2. Yeah, so 13. We'll call it 13. Now this is a tractor that didn't get a lot of oil changes in its life. So I just need to get it stable enough that I can get the same reading a few times. Okay, let's try for that. So we've got 12 there and 2 there. -12 plus 2. So I've got about 14.5 thou. Now look, I imagine that would be excessive. When we come to putting the crank in and measuring the crank, I'll give you all the figures. We're going to pull the crank out now, and I'll do a video on just pulling the crank out, and then I'll do a separate video over on the bench, and we'll actually measure the crank up, and we'll go through some of the figures that are acceptable. We need to know with ours, but look, those big end journals look really nice on this tractor. So for a tractor that didn't get too much loving, I think it's going pretty well. So we'll shift the camera up and we'll start pulling the crank out. Okay, the first part of the removal of the main bearings is just have a look if there's any numbers, any markings on them. I've put a centre pop mark here for number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, number 1 with a flat front where the timing cover and that goes, you couldn't muck that up. The big one in the centre, you couldn't muck that up, but you may be able to get him around the wrong way. And the back one, you couldn't muck that up, but these two middle ones, there's a chance that you could. So I'll try and keep my shadow out. So I've got mine marked. Now, they have lock tabs on them. You can buy the lock tabs. So we'll undo the lock tabs. Now I'll run through the lock tabs. I'll knock the whole lot off. I'm using a screwdriver. I bought this screwdriver set from Bunnings for 13 bucks with steel shanks. So they're the ones that are going to get the crap knocked out of them over the next series. See how we go. So look, I'll knock all these out and I'll come back once I've got them done, just in the interest of keeping the video short. Okay, you can see I've got all the tags knocked down and away. And another thing I probably should point out, that there's numbers, there's a little, it's not machined, it's been ground. There's numbers on these fellas, and they're all on the camshaft side, but you're going to need a 13/16 socket. The order that you undo these doesn't matter. My old Makita, this is a 1/2 inch, a BTW 450 Makita, and she seems to have a bit of go, this old 1/2 inch drive one. And it's still battery operated, 18 volt. Okay, so with bearing caps, normally you can pull the bolts up and give them a bit of a push-pull and get them loose sometimes. There we go, like that. So we lift that up. And you can see the big width of the bearing there. So I'll just come around here and give that a little bit of a wipe for you. And you can see there's some grey sections on it. That's wear. They're usually a bit whiter, and when they start eating through the bearing material, now where are we? If I can show you, just down here you can see a little line going across there. That's unworn and this is worn. So look, they are getting a bit worn. Now I'll roll a cap out and have a look on the back, and if I didn't cover this really well, I didn't think, in the pulling the pistons out, but yeah, the number on there is 311 23271, and there's no other marking on it that says 010, 020, anything like that. So it doesn't really matter what brand of bearings you buy or look for, they all seem to put 010, 020, so we can presume that this is a standard bearing. The crank on that journal, look, it's pretty good. That's just an oil stain mark as much as anything. So we'll rattle through and get the others off. I'll get a little pot for it. One of my trusty Renegade pots, my favourite. And we'll just put that on the ground and we'll drop all of these in. Now, sometimes you need to do this. So we'll surprisingly enough on this old engine, with all its wrecked pistons and things, that the bottom end is looking pretty good. So I'm hoping that we can use the crank. If you remember on our TEA 20 series, on the in-frame rebuild, the crank was worn on the mains, 1.5 thou more than it should have been. But I put new bearings in anyway, and away I went. Well, that tractor's got 60 pound oil pressure, runs like a beauty. So now this groove here is for a thrust. So I'll get the rag out of the way here. So that's the back of the thrust bearing is steel. The front is white metal. Actually, it's the other way around. That's the steel side here. Everyone's that black. So yeah, we have a part number stamped there, and that's the oil side. So they just sit into the cap like that, and the surface on the crank here, it's got a radiused edge here, and you'll notice quite a flange there. Well, that flange rubs up against the back one, and the surface against this flange here rubs against the front. So you have one front, one back. So that's all good. Now, you can, at times, just slide some of these out. So if you can get a bearing cap out, and I did this on the TEA 20 series, if you can pop a bearing all the way out, you can roll new ones in at times. So if I move the crank back for this rear one, should be able to wind that rear thrust bearing out. So that's just a way of doing it. Sometimes I've done it in the past. Your rear engine seal's leaking a lot, and you can actually roll some new thrust washers in. So, and this other one, once you get it moving, if you bring the crank back against it, that will wind it out as well. So sometimes you can do a quick fix just by doing that. So that's undoing everything that we need to undo with the crank. Now, what we should be able to do now, I'll put a rag over on my stool here, and I should be able to just lift that free. There we go. And the bearing stuck to it, that's no worries. So some of the bearings now, I'll just find one. Some bearings in the top here don't have an oil hole. They don't need one. That does have one, but some companies have them, some don't. But when you look at the block here, now, I might be able to turn that round a bit further for you. Yeah, see, that hole there, that's where the oil comes into that bearing. There's a little hole here where oil comes into that one. Same here. So if you have a plain bearing and one with a hole in it, the one with the hole in it lines up with the hole on the crank. And the other thing I might try and point out to you at this stage is, where can we, I think you can see that. So you can see the little tab in the bearing here, and that little tab stops the bearing from turning. And then to know if you've got the cap on the right way, you can just see a little mark there. So the other bearing shell sits there. So you have a small tab, that one there, you can just see him on the end profile, and the two tabs on a bearing always go together. So with this tab here, you can see the tab up here. Well, we know that this bearing would go there. The two tabs pretty well always go together. So that's a quick way of checking if your bearing caps are on the right way, that those two tabs are together. So, okay, that's popping the crank out. Next time you see the crank, we'll have it up on the bench and we'll run through a few measurements, and we'll talk about how to measure it and what we need to look for.